like to begin by asking you to consider a broad question. What makes a good adaptation of the Iliad? In this paper, I'm going to be looking at one particular attempt, the 2020 video game Troy, A Total War Saga. Ultimately, I'm going to be arguing that it represents a successful adaptation, not because it faithfully recreates the plot. Indeed, as an interactive, nonlinear object, it rejects that possibility, but because the process of playing the game adapts the process by which the Iliad itself was created. Ultimately, I will be demonstrating the way that the Iliad itself can be better understood as an interactive text. First, an introduction to the modern text. Troy, A Total War Saga is a 2020 video game developed by Creative Assembly. It's the 14th installment in a long-running series called Total War, which has sold over 36 million units to date. This particular installment simulates the battles of the Trojan War, beginning with the abduction of Helen, but concluding when the player's chosen Achaean or Trojan hero defeats their opponents and controls a significant section of the Mediterranean world. The game plays out largely over two broad genres. First, there's the tactical layer, a series of 3D battles between two armies which are conducted in real time. The player's role here is as an omniscient commander, floating above the battlefield, orchestrating the placement and maneuvers of each unit within the army, attempting ultimately to rout the enemy. Second is the strategic layer. This is a grand strategy mode played out above a map of the entire Hellenic world. This turn-based layer is a mix of features typical to the grand strategy or 4X genre, and can be understood as a series of discrete tasks relating to developing your overall objectives and to provide context for the individual battles. Tasks include moving troops, training soldiers, developing settlements, and establishing diplomatic relationships or trade. My claim that Troy, A Total War Saga is a good adaptation of the Iliad is not an unproblematic one, largely due to some interesting facts about the nature of video games themselves. Although the Iliad was clearly an inspiration for the game, after all, quotations appear before and after every battle, and the epic quest lines of the heroes are drawn straight out of the text, the developers themselves shied away from any claims of adaptation, as demonstrated in a 2019 interview with the lead developer. What I particularly like about the Iliad is that, at first glance, it looks like it glorifies war and slaughter and stuff like that, but actually, the main message is that it tells us about the inevitability of death and the uselessness of war, which is great. I mean, it was composed somewhere around 1,000 years BC, but those things still ring true today. And did you try to get those kind of themes into the game? Well, not particularly, no. We tried to recreate the Trojan War as faithfully as possible, so all the bloody battles are going to be there. And whenever you lose a battle, you will see the inevitability of death, and you'll realize that it was all useless. Other interviews support the idea that avoiding the themes of the Iliad, or indeed any sort of cohesive attempt at messaging, was done in the name of making the game fun. Whether intentionally or not, then, the developers clearly did not believe in their work as an adaptation, at least directly, drawing instead a line between video games and other types of text, suggesting that the primary goal of video games, unlike for literature, is simply the creation of fun. This replicates a broader debate among scholars, with some arguing that video games at their core are objects of play, and thus cannot even be called narrative or analyzed. The nature of interactivity and player agency causes further difficulty for analysis. For example, in my game, I might have played as Achilles attacking Troy, but in yours, you played as Paris quarreling with your brother. How can we compare our experiences, even assuming that a video game then did communicate narrative meaning? How can traditional analysis be performed given that the experience of a game is radically different from one play to another? What even is the text that we are analyzing? Even the ontological relationships between the text and the audience is arguably more complex in video games than in any other media, since the player, through their actions, has the ability to make changes within the world of the game, acting in those instances as an author, while also simultaneously remaining in the role of an audience, and thus interpreting the meaning. In this case, in case of games like this, the developer is more of a, quote, facilitator, not a creator of the events that transpire. Thankfully, there is a possible solution if we expand our definition of text to understand, as Ian Bogost argues, that, quote, for video games, the main representational mode is procedural rather than verbal. And, quote, when video games make arguments, they do it not with oral speech, nor in writing, nor even with images. Rather, video games make arguments with processes, unquote. That is particularly in what the game allows and what it does not, as well as how those choices are presented. So, for instance, in Troy Total War Saga, it is perhaps a significant argument that winning the game is always a function of military conquest. A study of Troy as adaptation, then, is thus an attempt to describe how the mechanisms that are in place reliably create meaning, rather than, say, any particular narrative that a player might develop. Given that the mechanisms themselves do not change, this has the advantage of avoiding all of the problems in text and author described above. But a focus on the way that processes create meaning is more instructive than it might appear, especially in the case of adapting the Iliad. Since, as we will see, the study of Homer's text can be understood to display almost all of the same problems and solutions. The work of Milman Parry in the 1920s changed the study of Homer forever, conclusively demonstrating that the Iliad was not the masterful literary work of a single genius, but was instead based on an ancient tradition of oral performance and formulaic composition. Since that bombshell, modern scholarship largely sees the Iliad not as a singular text, but instead as a representative of a matrix of possibilities. The Iliad is one single performance, constructed against the variable possibility set of all possible performances that might have been constructed. A key insight of oral theory is that each performance, including the Iliad itself, once, was unique and a spontaneous construction composed live in front of an audience, albeit a construction made according to a strict set of rules, which more easily allow the bard to assemble not just individual lines, but entire scene types. Performances then vary widely, even when a bard would have said that he was telling the quote-unquote same story. Attempting to understand the Iliad within this tradition, then, already resembles a bit the key problem that was encountered in our study of video games. How can you study a text when it is just one example of something which was constantly changing, was different for each hearer? For the oralists, this then was primarily the study of the rules of these compositions. For our interests, the more relevant direction comes from the narratologists, of whom I would like to highlight Irene de Jong's masterful commentaries on the Iliad and the Odyssey. Expanding Roland Barthes' insights, narratology studies the processes by which meaning is created between a speaker, or in this case a singer, and his or her audience, and the way in which a reader infers meaning from that performance, with or without explicit narrative. It's no mistake that Bogost, who constructed the idea of implicit meaning for video games, considered his own analysis as akin to narratology. Thus, importantly, as with video games, we are essentially studying an interactive media by looking at the processes by which a bard generated meaning, particularly the way in which the bard interacted with his or her audience. Although I will ultimately be arguing that the processes by which a video game creates meaning are themselves comparable or adaptations of the Homeric processes that create meaning, and thus adaptations. At this level, it should be noted that video games are clearly akin to oral composition. The absolute strength of the comparison, the absolute strength of looking at this as an adaptation, is that it reminds us of the central fact that the Iliad itself was created in an interactive process, and it existed in a conversation between the performer and the audience. It calls our attention to something in the original text that otherwise we might forget. Even the oralists mostly ignore this interactivity, particularly because Homer himself pretends that such a relationship does not exist. But this papers over the reality that each performance was a complex and careful negotiation. For instance, on Homer's reluctance to discuss the social pressure that was exerted over bards, you can see Svenbro 1976. But it's apparent that even in the text itself, that Homer's bards are absolutely influenced by the audience that they're presenting to. Because of space, I can only sketch this argument briefly, but for instance, there are 3 times in Odyssey 1, 8, and 11 that stories are explicitly interrupted with a specific request from the audience. In at least the case of Demodocus' stories in Book 8, as another example, he seems to switch the sorts of stories that he tells based on Odysseus' emotional reaction. Further, there are constant examples of a storyteller modifying their story based on who is present. A good example of this is that Odysseus seems to include a catalog of famous women, seemingly in deference to the presence of the Queen Arete. Now that the general point has been made that Troy: A Total War Saga could function as an adaptation and the grounds under which the comparison could be made, I would now like to illustrate the overall point by briefly looking at a few comparable processes, paying attention particularly to those which bridge the gap between audience and narrator, between audience and player, and then allow the audience an interactive role in tailoring their own experience of the narrative. In Troy: A Total War Saga, the player is presented with a set of choices at the beginning of the game, each choice of which, I will argue, is evidenced within Homer's own choices, especially in the proem of the Iliad. The first choice asks the player to pick one of three campaigns: historical, truth behind the myth, or mythological. These three modes vary primarily in their approach to quote-unquote realism. In the default mode, you have heroes capable of fighting whole units by themselves and invisible gods, but nothing we would call overtly unbelievable. At the other end of the spectrum, you have either a game utterly devoid of anything we might call unrealistic, including making the heroes now surrounded by bodyguards and no presence of the gods at all. At the other end, of course, you have the mythological game, where your army can include giant monsters and visible gods on the battlefield. Functionally, this choice allows the player, at the beginning, to make a profound statement about their views on the Homeric text on the past before playing. It's important to note, though, that these choices make almost no difference on the overall gameplay experience. The core gameplay loop remains the same. In most cases, even, an unrealistic unit such as a griffin or Medusa is replaced with the realistic alternative, if you play in one of the more grounded modes. That is to say, this is almost solely an aesthetic choice, which helps the player refine the narrative that they are themselves developing in their own mind. There's reason to think that this choice was critical to Homer's audience as well. Although, for modern readers, Homer's text is unquestionably mythical, with its larger-than-life warriors and divine intervention, this is likely not the way an original Greek audience would have viewed it, for whom the gods were, after all, an unquestioned fact. Instead, Homer's text is actually praised in antiquity precisely because of its realism. For a broader discussion of this realism, see Irene de Jong 2005. Indeed, one of the first choices of an oral singer would have been about the level of credibility in front of an audience and what level of impossibility they would accept. A bard, for instance, might specialize in realistic epics, like those that Phemius tells in Book 1, or ribald folk tales, such as the story of Ares and Aphrodite told by Demodocus in Book 8. When listening to the stories of Odysseus, for instance, the king Alcinous specifically calls out the believability granted by Odysseus' masterful storytelling ability, even though the stories that Odysseus is telling are objectively fantastical. Some scholars have even more productively claimed that the Iliad itself exhibits a marked and unique interest in breaking away from the overtly magical or supernatural elements which otherwise would have characterized the larger epic tradition, particularly ignoring hybrid monsters, faraway locations, and superpowers, instead allowing Homer to create, uniquely for him, a more grounded human story in opposition to the fantastical. This is evidence, perhaps, as Homer chooses to modify even some very famous stories, such as Meleager's death when his mother burns his immortal brand, or the idea that Achilles himself is invulnerable except in one place. Homer instead omits these unbelievable folk tales in the name, perhaps, of credibility. Next, the player is allowed to choose their faction, a choice which is presented thematically as a choice between one of 11 Homeric heroes. The choice provides a fairly standard set of information common in strategy games, including starting location, number of settlements, unit choices, etc. But the choice of each hero also presents a unique set of mechanics which greatly color your experience of the gameplay. For instance, Achilles vacillates between a series of extreme moods, with massive effects on the entirety of the player's territory. Keep him outside of combat too long and he becomes indignant. Your territory will flourish, but diplomacy becomes impossible. Lose a favorite hero and he starts grieving, boosting your favor with the gods, but lowering the happiness of your entire empire. On the other hand, keep him engaged in battles too frequently, or if he becomes wounded or loses, he becomes outraged, dramatically increasing the power of his own army at the cost of your entire empire. The sum result, though, is that while the gameplay experience still remains fundamentally about conquering the world, fighting individual battles, that the context has now changed in the way that develops a deeper narrative within your own mind. That is, that the player's story now is not just about fighting a series of opponents, but about managing the titanic moods of this larger-than-life figure. And indeed, each of the 11 heroes has a set of mechanics which similarly transform your game experience. Agamemnon needs to, for instance, manage a royal court. Odysseus' power is derived from a network of spies. Hector and Paris have to compete for their father's favor. In essence, the player is given authority over the sort of story that they want to tell and the way that they want to experience that narrative. It should come as no surprise that the choice of hero was critical to oral storytellers and Homer as well. Though it's difficult to imagine the Trojan War without Achilles, choosing to center his story may very well have been an innovation particular to the Homeric bard. The stories of other heroes were likely in circulation as well, making this a conscious choice. The neo-analysts have indeed even long claimed that the particular story of Achilles' conflict with the Trojan hero Memnon, represented now only extant in the epic tradition, which ends with his death at the hands of Paris, might actually be the model and provide the broad template over which the Iliad is constructed, making Patroclus, for instance, made up, substituted solely for Nestor's son, or indeed Hector inserted as an otherwise made-up character to cover for the otherwise godlike Memnon. At any rate, it's very clear, according to M.L. West, that circulating stories of Achilles' death preceded the composition of the Iliad. He goes further, even, suggesting that the very presence, the very existence of Achilles himself may have been a relatively late addition to the Homeric catalog, to the catalog of all oral storytellers, and that earlier epic tradition omitted Achilles completely. That is, the choice of Achilles was one particular storyteller or set of storytellers making their mark on the broader tradition. More, our two surviving texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey, suggest that, as in Troy, a Total War Saga, that the way the story was told was likely reflecting, at least in part, the hero chosen at the center of the narrative. While the Iliad, for instance, is a bloody reflection on war and mortality, as reflects its focus on the sullen, warlike Achilles, the Odyssey is instead a complex meta-narrative privileging the act of storytelling itself, as befits its particular Protean hero, Odysseus. From the above options, I've focused on some of the ways that the narratives can be shaped at the beginning. But it's also important to note that the game also allows ways to modify the narrative mid-telling, and that this set of options was available to the bard as well. It's clear, for instance, that an enormous degree of time and expense was placed into developing and rendering the 3D real-time battles of Troy, a Total War Saga. But although there's a great deal of agency in the player's initial positioning and in the maneuvering stage, once the units are actually engaged with each other, largely speaking, there's not anything the player can do to affect the outcome, except wait for the conflict to resolve. The decision, then, to have battles play out in real time creates a situation where the player functionally has nothing to do except watch. This decision, combined with the necessary addition of a free-floating camera, important because of the 3D environment, springs an interesting set of supplementary decisions. Because of the cinematic scope of what's being depicted, as well as the aesthetic appeal of the images, in the moments where the player lacks overt control, they are instead encouraged to use the camera to dramatically film the battle as it goes on, finding suitably epic angles to watch, swooping down to capture the perspective of an individual troop, diving low into the chaotic midst of combat, raking across the whole mass of troops, or zooming down to nervously watch the outcome of a critical duel. None of these presentational choices, indeed, none of the care heaped upon the 3D models in general, changed the gameplay at all. but they do have an enormous impact on the player's experience and immersion, the narrative that develops in their mind. A similar set of tools was available to the Homeric Bard as well. As I described the free-floating camera of Troy: A Total War Saga, I'm of course reminded of the quote from Van Wees, 1997, when he was attempting to defend a constant complaint that Homer unrealistically focuses on single combat rather than the massive movement of troops that must have been going on. He says, quote, Homer constructs his battle scenes instead much as a film director might do. He opens with a panoramic image of the forces drawing up and advancing, then zooms in on the action, thereafter cuts back and forth between close-ups of different heroes in the tale and wide-angled views of the army at large. During close-ups, the general action recedes into the background or falls out of frame, and a superficial impression is created of warriors fighting duels in isolation. The background, however, is never forgotten. We're regularly reminded that our heroes are not alone, but instead fighting on the ground or among the frontline warriors, and that they are the target of many missiles. What I particularly like about Van Wees' here description is the number of techniques that he brings up. That is to say, while the plot of Homeric battles, particularly the result of any individual one-on-one conflict or the whole battle, are often quite straightforward and predictable in terms of plot, that the depictions of those battles, then, are under control of the poet, and they can use any number of different combinations of the patterns that are typical of the oral tradition in order to create interest. What might be forgotten, though, in this idea, this Van Wees' idea of carefully controlled filmic narrative, is that, unlike in a film, the Homeric Bard is essentially creating this variation on the fly, and we should understand this as an interactive process, because he's doing this based on what he wants to tell about the battle overall, yes, but he's also paying attention to his audience and is able to vary based on the interests and attentions of his audience, switching to heroes that they might be interested in, or pulling back or forward based on what he sees in the audience at large. So what? Although the point of this presentation was overall to discuss the relationship between the Iliad and Troy: A Total War Saga, a goal which I hope to have accomplished, and to discuss Troy as an adaptation of the Iliad and the advantages of that method, I would like to leave with just a hint of the implications generated by this method, and the potential that exists for future work. Because at this point, the groundwork has been established for us to make larger arguments about how the meanings of these two works might compare. I can only do this very briefly, though. There's one choice that we haven't really discussed, and that's where the game has positioned the player. The player's view of Troy: A Total War Saga is consistently that of a detached overhead camera, either floating far above the controlled settlements, viewing a significant section of the Hellenic world, or indeed floating high above the battlefield. And this is not a natural or neutral choice. When Homer chooses to depict a distant, far-off view, it is the view of the divine, who, the Iliad, by the way, reminds us time and time again, are fundamentally not like humans. Because they're immortal, the actions that are unfolding for them are fundamentally not serious. Even when the divinities themselves are wounded, it's often played for laughs, because in the end, for the immortals, there are no real lasting threats or consequences. Homer, though, wants to contrast this view with more intimate human moments, never letting us forget that while such a carefree view of war, such a distant view where it's simply something that's happening to other people, that's a view that might be true for the gods, and perhaps even for the people who are listening to the Iliad, that in the mortal world, these actions are tragic. What does it mean, though, that Troy only implicates us in the carefree divine view, only ever presents us as a distant participant to war? For us, then, in Troy: A Total War Saga, war is simply a fun game, never contrasted as Homer does with the intimate human moments. It really displays war as a conflict of numbers. Sieging a town simply changes the color on a map. Any losses can simply be avoided by reloading and starting over. Is this a clever attempt at adaptation? Perhaps attempting to bring us into the mindset of ancient heroes, where violence is simply part of the story, an expected thing, something that likely large sections of the oral tradition would have endorsed, a view that I would claim Homer himself rejects. Or perhaps is this carefree approach to war, this distant view of violence, say something instead disturbing about our own relationship with war? Thank you.